Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenburg back on the show, and we're going to be continuing our discussion of the Microsoft Secure Future Initiative. Now, this will serve as part 2 of this 2-part series. If you haven't watched part 1, go back and watch last week's episode where we kind of start this discussion and kick it off. But today we're going to be finishing the discussion, so we'll be talking again the Microsoft Secure Future Initiative and lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Well, I want to spend some time talking about the second pillar specifically, because this is the one in the announcement that made me slam my forehead against the desk. And that is, of course, identity. We talked about the identity piece a little bit so far already in this episode. And they simply state that the second pillar of the Secure Future Initiative is to strengthen identity. And it's interesting because Eric and I, the same episode I mentioned earlier, Eric had made the prediction that's like, okay, yeah, when we talk about infrastructure directly, the public cloud is always going to be more secure than your on-premises environment, right? And then he said, except for the identity mechanisms, right? Those areas.
I listened to the episode.
Yep, those doorways where the cloud services are letting in the legitimate users. And it wasn't, I want to say it was like 2 weeks later, news of this breach, Storm 0558 breach occurred, right? So I called him a prophet back then, but he's absolutely right though, because identity is always going to be the target. So it makes sense that identity is a big focus of SFI, but in their announcement, there's a paragraph here that I want to read because we talk about it being it doesn't seem to be a huge culture shift. And when I read this paragraph, this is the paragraph, like I said, it just made me want to slam my head against the desk. And I quote here, direct, and I'll link the article that I'm pulling this from in the show notes. And I quote, "Second, we will strengthen identity protection against highly sophisticated attacks. Identity-based threats like password attacks have increased tenfold during the past year, with nation-states and cybercriminals developing more sophisticated techniques to steal and use login credentials. As Charlie explains, we will protect against these changing threats by applying our most advanced identity protection through a unified and consistent process that will manage and verify the identities and access rights of our users, devices, and services across all our products and platforms. We will also make these advanced capabilities freely available to non-Microsoft application developers." With the exception of the last sentence, this said nothing. It said nothing that we.
I completely agree.
It's nothing here that
it's marketing.
Yeah, there's nothing here that we didn't already know. I mean, we know password attacks have increased. We know that nation states and cyber criminals are becoming more sophisticated. And then they basically say that we're going to apply our most advanced identity protection through a unified and consistent process, which they already have that. That's already there.
I know. Yeah, I know. I know, mate. This is I'm no wiser than you. I read that and I go, oh yeah, well that sounds fine. It means nothing really,
right? And
it's not something that is measurable and realistic and targeted that we can actually see changes in, right? Again, we talked about identity protection, the feature of Entra ID, and how I think that should be available to everybody. I suppose here there's also the fact that if you look at an individual tenant, Microsoft is in a bit of a bind here because a lot of that is actually not under their control. Like they control the Entra ID side, but if a tenant goes, we're going to stick with username and passwords because it's easier for our users, right? And they're going to get compromised. It's not Microsoft's fault, right? That's the shared responsibility model. They can't fix that. Now, one of the interesting things they are doing, and I do want to talk about two things here. The first one is that they are implementing conditional access policies for users, for tenants who are using conditional access. So you're getting Microsoft managed conditional access policies show up in your tenant. So I'll give you a quick history here. So for a long time, Microsoft has had conditional access, and if you have Entra ID P1 or P2, you can use it, and you get all these fantastic conditional access policies. Up until a few years ago, you sort of had to write them from scratch. So Microsoft found they weren't used very heavily. So they did two things. They first implemented something called security defaults. So a small organization today that spins up a new Microsoft 365 tenant automatically gets security defaults turned on. That automatically implements MFA for everybody, no exceptions, no break glass accounts. You don't get conditional access policies, but you just get a secure baseline. They then retroactively applied that to older clients, as well, older tenants as well. Now what they're doing is saying, okay, that covers everybody who's basic, who do not use conditional access. That generally is smaller clients who don't have an IT company doing it for them. Now we're going to go after the medium and the larger organizations that are using conditional access. And we're going to give them a set of policies that we think are the minimum baseline. We're going to put them into your tenant. For 90 days, they're going to be in report-only mode. So report-only mode, for those of you who don't know in conditional access, is I don't want to be fired by my boss. So I've made this policy, but it's not actually enforcing the controls. It's just reporting that it would have enforced controls on these sign-ins. And then you can go through and see, did I actually block the CEO 5 minutes before he was going to give his presentation to the board? In which case I need to tweak my policy before I actually enforce it and not just have it in report-only mode. So 90 days, they show up in your tenant. There's 3 policies, and I'll read them off here now. One is require MFA for admin portals. Have that shown up in 2 of my clients' tenants already. The other one is require MFA for per user MFA users. Quick sidetrack to explain. When Microsoft initially provided MFA in Azure AD, you turned it on a per user basis. So you didn't need to use a conditional access policy. That also gave you less control. It's also more management overhead to do it on a per user basis. So Microsoft is migrating away from that. This policy will help you do that. And then finally, require MFA for high risk sign-ins. If you have P2 and you have a highly risky sign-in, you will automatically have to do an extra MFA prompt because the system is detecting, hey, there's something funky going on here. Now, that only applies to P2 tenants, and I suspect that if you are a P2 tenant, you already have a policy for that, but at least you're getting one. So that could be part of the explanation for that word marketing salad.
Could be. Is
these things are the things they're doing behind the scenes, right? But it doesn't say that. It's not practical. It's written for, I don't know who.
It would have been nice for them. So I get that maybe they want that blog article that I pulled this from to speak to a wide audience, right? Maybe business leaders that don't necessarily understand the technical stuff, but it would have been nice to at least have a subheading that says, if you want more technical detail, click here, and it sends you to a blog article that says, here are the features, these are the settings, this is exactly what we're doing. So all of us security professionals can be like, oh, okay, we feel better now type of thing. You know what I mean?
Yep. It's all about that perception again and the trustworthiness. And when you're transparent and you really show your cards where you're at, then people go, okay, yeah, I can see that, you know?
Yeah.
That's the thing when you have a breach, trying to cover it. And I'm not saying Microsoft did that, but a lot of other organizations tend to try to cover it up because they think that's the right thing to do. That just makes people lose their confidence even more, right? Whereas if you're transparent and you say, yep, this is how they get in, this is what happened, this is what we've done to mitigate it, this is what we've done to make sure it never happens again, those organizations get an A+ from most people, even non-technical people, right? To go, oh yeah, okay, that's fair enough. Like a lot of organizations get compromised, but you seem to have it in hand, so I'll keep trusting you.
Yeah, exactly. It's unfortunate. There's a couple other areas that we haven't talked about yet that were part of this big announcement, right? And the third pillar, I don't think we mentioned it briefly, but we haven't talked about it a whole lot yet. And it's kind of one of those like, yeah, okay, type of things, right? They basically said we want to cut vulnerability patching times by 50%, right? Which, okay, noble goal. You know, I like it. It's a good thing. A couple of things from my end on this particular case. One, how is it being measured, right? I'd love to know how it's being measured. And two, we've really had a lack of transparency. And you and I have talked about this on the show before, Paul. So we've had a lack of transparency when it comes to vulnerabilities within the Microsoft Cloud ecosystem. I'm sure they have their own internal CVEs and things of that nature, but we never hear about them. Like I have no idea what's happening within Microsoft Cloud Services. And a part of me is like, okay, do I really need to know? And then there's another part of me that's like, yes, I need to know if there's these vulnerabilities going on. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
From a security point of view, and you just froze. Oh, there you go. You're back. Yeah. Yes, good. Sorry, you froze for a second.
No
so
worries.
I just want to make sure we're good. So this is one of the things that we have discussed on a previous episode as well, and the fact that there is no transparency for vulnerabilities in the cloud, and that goes for all the clouds. They're all the same. They don't show you what problems they have behind the scenes. Now, in some scenarios, and the one I think we mentioned in the episode when we discussed this was this Power Apps issue, where you could get into other people's Power Apps. Yep. And because there was no transparency, other organizations, like you could have a bank, right, whose Power Apps are now visible to other tenants in Azure. And the bank has no way, because they don't get, like, it's not a CVE that's published to say, hey, we found this problem, we're going to patch it in 2 weeks or whatever, right? Because they don't have that visibility. They have no way of mitigating that risk to themselves, right? So I think that that visibility is important. And again, as you say, patch time by 50%. Well, compared to what? We don't know what your benchmark is today.
Exactly.
Now, I mean, I think it's a good realization because the bad guys are moving faster. As we've also discussed previously, they do get onto vulnerabilities much faster, right? And some organizations are like on a monthly or 60-day patch cycle, and that's just not cutting it today. Like you just can't do that today. But it is very, very, very hard to patch everything all the time. And I do want to mention one quick thing here. Mudge, who was the CISO at Twitter for a while, a bit before Elon took over, and then became a whistleblower about all the problems they had, and they're much worse now. But anyway, he gave a presentation some month ago at a conference that I saw a recording of. And he was talking about there is a persistent myth that patching your stuff always fixes security problems. Well, it turns out that this university did a big analysis of lots of software packages. And it turns out that the truth is actually, yes, it sometimes fixes some of the problems, but you actually tend to have more security problems after patching. Now, that was not true for Google Chrome and all the browsers built on Chromium. That was not true for Windows. It wasn't true for Mac OS. It wasn't true for iOS. And it wasn't true for Android, I think, from memory. But basically all the other things that don't have big security teams, that don't take security seriously enough, those patches not necessarily going to get you into a better place.
Right.
But what are you going to do? It's probably better to patch than not patch, I think. So.
And I guess when I look at that, I'm like, okay, well, I'd rather protect myself against what is known and known by threat actors out there than, not, by introducing new unknown security vulnerabilities, I guess.
Yep, that's exactly it.
Yeah, interesting. Well,
so the last piece I think that we wanted to talk, I suggest 2 bits, but one is working to make keys inaccessible. So I did want to talk about this briefly.
I have thoughts.
I have thoughts too, but I want to give the technical background again to what that actually means, because again, it's not explained in the SFI article or SFI blog post. So in the show notes below, which will be like a page long by this stage, we will have a link to the BRK 294H session from Ignite that was about a month ago. And essentially, Alex Weinert and a couple of other people, but Alex is the one talking mostly about what we're focused on here, talks about what they're going to do. So he gives a bit of a background on the Storm 000558 attack, how they found it, a bit of a timeline and all that sort of stuff, which was interesting. Then he talks about how they're building their key system for the future. So one of the things that we heard from Senator Ron Wyden in the US and a lot of other security professionals was, why weren't these keys in HSMs? And I think one of the reasons they weren't in an HSM was because Microsoft didn't realize that this risk existed to this level, right, and they didn't realize how they were going to be compromised this way. So they were sort of caught with their pants down. But the other reason is this is pretty hard, because for those of you who know what a hardware security module is, this is a box you put in your data center, you put your keys in, and now you can read them out to do security operations with, but you can't actually get the keys out. And that works fine as long as your data center doesn't go down.
Right.
If your data center goes down, now you've got a problem because you can't get your HSM. Now, if you're running Azure AD or Entra ID globally for many hundreds of millions of people worldwide, you have to build a system that has HSMs all over the planet and doesn't bind the key to an individual HSM, but manages to bind the key to all the HSMs so that you can have high availability and resiliency. They're also building a system where no people will have access to the keys. It's only application to application. They're building a system where it's all built on confidential computing. So quick sidetrack here. For a long time, we know how to protect data at rest, disk encryption and file encryption. We know how to protect data in transit, TLS. All the websites we use are using HTTPS and other wire encryption protocols. But we haven't really cracked how do you deal with data that is being processed? Because if you have a Microsoft system for keys that is running on servers, and those servers are being virtualized, let's say, or even if they were on physical machines, if that machine crashes, you now have those keys stored in memory if you can get to the memory. Right. So confidential computing allows you to build systems, and this has been, I started writing articles on confidential computing a good 5 years ago.
It's been around for a while now.
It first became available in Azure, yeah. So special hardware, CPUs, protects and encrypts the memory of running processes so that not even the host can get to it. So if you're on a virtualization platform like Hyper-V in Azure and the VM crashes or you attach a debugger to it, you cannot see the confidential computing memory because it's all encrypted. So, and there's all sorts of attestation as all part of that. So that's very cool technology. And to me, this is great. Like, I am absolutely certain that once this system is completely done, they're targeting 2024, we don't know exact timelines, the Chinese or nobody else will ever steal these keys in the same way that they did before. That's very cool technology. But my question would be, okay, this is one skeleton in the closet that the Chinese found for you and pointed out for you. But Chinese nation state hackers, we shouldn't blame the whole country for what the hackers did. But what other skeletons do you have in the closet? What other parts of your logical underlying infrastructure did you not think could be misused in this way? Because that's where the attacker is going to go next time. They ain't going to go after this system, right? Because when Microsoft's own engineers don't even have access to the system, like, it's going to be no people access. Even if you, send bad guys with guns to your home and threaten your children, the engineer literally will have no way of getting to those keys, even if you wanted to, right? So that's fine, but I wonder what else they need to focus on. And again, we don't have the transparency, we don't have the showing that the security culture has changed to that level, so we don't know. We really don't know if there is anything.
And we come back to
any other skeleton.
We come back to perception again, right? Because this was my big thing with this particular case is like, okay, they're going to make keys inaccessible. But we had already been told that, hey, the keys are going to live in HSMs and they're going to be inaccessible. We were already told they were inaccessible, And so, again, it comes back to the skeletons in the closet, right? So it comes down to perception and trust. And I guess this is one of those, we'll wait and see things. And maybe we'll revisit this in a year and nothing will have happened. And that'll be great. I'll raise a glass on that day, right?
Me too.
Anyway, well, the one last kind of interesting tidbit I kind of found in this article was a call for a digital Geneva Convention, which, I don't know, I kind of felt like this was a weird place for that, right? So, I mean, they're talking about their how they're going to improve security, right? And then they basically said we should call on the countries of the world to have a digital Geneva Convention to get every country to agree to not attack cloud services. That's basically what they said in the article, and it's
Well, what they said was we should have a digital Geneva Convention not to harm critical infrastructure, which could harm civilians.
True.
And then they said we would like cloud services to be classed as critical infrastructure. And I'm like,
that's
no.
very
No,
true,
sorry.
because I was looking at this from their perspective, and you're absolutely right. They did say we do think that public cloud should be considered critical infrastructure, and I agree that critical infrastructure should not be a target. But let's assume this digital Geneva Convention happens. Let's assume, right? There's no way that, your threat actors of the world are going to be like, yeah, you know what? You guys are right. I'll hang up my hat and, yeah, we'll leave you alone. It's just, I love the sentiment. I do, but it's just not realistic.
It's not realistic, and I think this is Brad Smith, the chief lawyer at Microsoft. He has been on this horse for a while. He's a very smart guy,
He is.
but I think he's barking up the wrong tree. I mean, this is just not realistic. Take some recent examples. Well, let's talk about Ukraine. As we're talking about this, the biggest telco in Ukraine was brought down by the Russians. Like last week or something like that, and I'm like, yeah, well, that makes sense. It's a wartime. Listening to people talking about what the impact to the country is, I'm thinking, well, that is critical infrastructure. It's going to put strain on the other two telcos, but it's not the end of the world. And the Ukrainians are very, very resilient. They'll work around it. And then you got to be a little bit careful here. Because when you're talking about, hey, don't attack critical infrastructure and don't do that, and I agree that would be nice if people did, but that's not how nation-state attackers work, and it also is not how criminals work, right? Because if there's money to be made, they're going to go after hospitals. We've seen them do it, right? Schools and all sorts of horrible things. But we also do it, right? Like the Western world. Don't forget, we, like the NSA, is the biggest spook organization on the planet, right? Like, are you going to tell me they're not up in China's business or in Russia's business? They're much more stealthy about it. Their primary objective is always don't be discovered, but they're not perfect, and they will be discovered here and there. And I don't know, obviously Ed Snowden's leaks and all that. So, you got to be a little bit careful pointing the finger at the other bad guys for doing bad things, because I suspect we're doing it as well. And that will go for Australia as well. If my Australian signals director is doing their job, they're hacking all sorts of places all over the place.
Right. Yeah, don't look in the mirror, right?
Exactly. That's right. That's exactly right.
Well,
so a couple of good points I want to point out here for a minute, just as sort of context for this whole discussion, because we don't want to just bag Microsoft.
Right, exactly.
Microsoft is serious about adopting Rust for memory safety. Quick sidetrack here. A lot of programming languages have issues around memory safety, meaning you can write code that allows buffer overruns and other attacks like that, where memory gets to be used in ways that shouldn't be used. Now, you can write memory safe code with C#, for example, but people don't. Whereas a programming language like Rust, doesn't allow you to muck it up, basically. Again, I'm not a developer, but that's the gist of how I see that or what I hear from people. They're killing NTLM in Windows, so the new technology LAN manager protocol that is like 30 years old
Right.
now. They don't have the really old versions that were really insecure, but even so, that's going away. They're implementing some local Kerberos systems so that you can have that even when you don't have line of sight to a domain controller. We talked about the automatic CA policies. I mentioned that. That's good. And just as a very quick sideline here, there's also some internal movement at Microsoft that may be related to improving security. So we got a new CISO, Igor Tsygansky, and he just left Bridgewater. He starts on January the 1st. Brett Arsenault, who has been the CISO, I saw two different figures, 8 years and 14 years, but he's been for a really long time. He's become the Chief Security Advisor or Advisor. And his deputy, Anchal Gupta, is moving to the Office Product Group. Now, these shakeups, like if Igor had a meeting with Satya and Satya said, look, you're my second in command here. You can go to any developer, any program manager, any organization as part of Microsoft. You can look at their security posture, and if it stinks, you can tell them you guys are not putting out a single new feature until you get your security in order, and you've got to do this consistently, and I'm going to come down on like a hammer if you don't. If he has that mandate, then maybe we see this culture shift, but I don't know. Does he have that mandate? Is that how it's going to work? Who knows?
That's another time will tell, right?
It very much is. Very, very much
Time will tell. Well, Paul, we've covered a lot of ground in this episode. Well, realistically, episodes at this point, right? Because we try to keep these episodes at 25 to 30 minutes roughly. So this is going to be a two-parter, definitely. But we will be talking about this issue again, I'm sure, specifically because, as we mentioned earlier, the U.S. government Cybersecurity Review Board has not finished their report on this whole incident yet. And when they do, that will definitely influence U.S. government policy, not only when it comes to Microsoft cloud services, but cloud services in general, right? Because I remember when this whole thing came up initially, the Cybersecurity Review Board first was focused on this breach. And then it pivoted slightly to we're going to reevaluate cloud services government-wide. So you're starting to see this trend, not just with the U.S. government, but governments around the world, where they're starting to lose patience with breaches of this nature, right? So, Paul, when that happens, when that report comes out, I'm sure you're going to be one of the first people I call, and I'm like, hey, it's time for another episode, right?
I think so too. I really do think so. Their previous one, looking at the lapsus kids, was a very interesting read, and
it was.
I think it should be required reading for any CISO. So I'm looking forward to this one, and I'm sure we'll have another chat about it and see whether they agree with our pontifications on on what Microsoft should be doing and not doing, and whether they have other ideas. It'll be interesting to see.
Yep, it'll be interesting to see for sure. Well, Paul, I want to thank you for spending an hour of your time with us. It's always good having you, my friend.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you for your time as well, and I hope I didn't offend anybody by comparing Microsoft to an alcoholic. But anyway, that's what happens.
No, I hope not. I think we're fine. So, and those of you watching, appreciate you spending some time with us. And as always, if you want to continue watching the show, be sure to hit that like and or subscribe button. Depending on your platform, we are available out on YouTube, as well as all the major podcasting platforms. With that, we'll let you get back to the rest of your day. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you for a future episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Stay safe out there.